Moscow, June the 24th, 1945. Soviet troops assemble at a victory parade for their wartime leader, Joseph Stalin. Communism has defeated fascism in the Great Patriotic War. Flags and army banners once belonging to the fallen enemy lie at the General Secretary's feet.
Stalin war auch ein Erbe der Zaren.
Tsarism was part of Stalin's heritage, right? Somehow, if you take a look at his foreign policy, his policy towards the Balkan states, the similarities to Tsarist imperial foreign policy are startling. There was a very interesting episode. Ambassador Harriman, the famous Avril Harriman, ambassador to Moscow at the end of the Second World War, greets Stalin at the Potsdam Conference in Sicilienhof and says, "Marshal Stalin, you must be very happy to be here, standing in the capital city of your enemy as victor." Harriman reported that Stalin answered with, "Tsar Alexander made it all the way to Paris."
Joseph Vissarionovich Djugashvili was born in Georgia in 1879. He grew up in humble circumstances, the son of a shoemaker. His mother wants him to become a priest. An intelligent pupil, he receives a scholarship to the seminary in Tbilisi, the only institution for higher learning in Georgia. A social democrat since 1898, he's imprisoned and ostracized for revolutionary activities. Stalin, the man of steel as he now calls himself, joins the Bolsheviks and is voted into the Central Committee at Lenin's request in 1912. After the February Revolution of 1917, he returns from exile and takes on the post of editor-in-chief of Pravda, the party newspaper.
He understood the value of information. It's not the position that makes you powerful, that gives power, but information. In the beginning was the word.
After the October Revolution, Lenin appoints the shy Georgian to the post of People's Commissar for Nationalities Affairs. Lenin believes that the chaotic after-effects of the First World War will cause the bourgeois governments in Europe to collapse under the pressure of the international proletariat. But a world revolution didn't happen. Civil war rages in Russia. The Bolsheviks, led by War Commissar Leon Trotsky, emerge victorious. Russia is now the only country to be ruled by communists. After Lenin suffers his first stroke in 1922, Trotsky reviews the parade celebrating the 5th anniversary of the October Revolution. Although Trotsky is now treated as Lenin's successor, Stalin has begun a struggle for power.
Stalin was in the second tier of the revolution's leadership, a power-hungry apparatchik who used bureaucratic backdoors, intrigue, terror, threats and corruption to get power and to keep it.
Of course, nobody could foresee who will be Stalin. I don't think that Lenin saw, yes, Stalin was dangerous.
The Communist Party chiefs gather around Lenin's casket. Only one of them is missing, Leon Trotsky. Stalin sends Trotsky the wrong burial date to prevent him from attending the funeral services. Stalin carries the casket along with his comrades Zinoviev and Kamenev. The triumvirate has a common goal. They want to divide Lenin's power among themselves.
After the Bolsheviks failed to bring about the proletarian revolution around the world, the Bolshevik Party was desperate for a new vision, and Stalin provided one.
There are historical situations where it's not necessarily the most clever, not necessarily the one with the most foresight, but the person who says, with something like fanatical obsession, "I know the way, comrades."
Stalin was now saying, we're strong enough to expand socialism on our own. And with that, Stalin appealed to Bolshevik national pride.
Establish socialism in one country, in Russia, is his slogan. The market-oriented economics brought about by Lenin's new economic policy is incompatible with Stalin's communist vision. His goal is a classless society with the means of production held by the state.
About 1926-25, Stalin called the new economic policy into question and then abolished it. He abolished the alcohol prohibition that Nicholas II put into effect in 1914, and that was even upheld in spite of the Civil War until about 1926. Then Stalin said, "A drunk man doesn't care about politics."
Der getrunkene Mann denkt nicht an die Politik.
Stalin war ein relativ beschränkter, was seine theoretischen Begabungen.
Stalin's theoretical abilities were relatively limited, which helps explain why he was scorned by any number of Bolshevik theorists. What Stalin and Lenin had in common was an extraordinary feel for the spirit of the times they lived in.
Für den jeweiligen Zeitgeist.
The first thing he did was push Leon Trotsky, a believer in world revolution, out of his official posts for leaning too far left of the party line. Then Stalin turned against his one-time comrades. Zinoviev and Kamenev were stripped of their power. Kamenev was returned to grace and to his posts only after a show of humiliating self-criticism.
Stalin appealed
to the democratic and egalitarian tendencies within the new party base. As he said at the 15th Bolshevik Party Congress in December of 1927, "We don't need nobility in the party."
Stalin has Trotsky, his most dangerous opponent, imprisoned, and in the finest Tsarist tradition, exiled to Siberia. Following that, he had adherents of Lenin's new economic policy discredited as right-wing dissidents and removed from power.
Stalin was a very precise and focused politician when it came to his political and personal positions of power. And a huge country was subjected to these power interests of his. The leading representatives of the Stalinist faction were not merely instruments of Stalin's power, they were his comrades in spirit, and it was with their help that he was able to execute this unprecedented revolution from above.
With the presentation of the first five-year plan, the project of building socialism in one country has begun. Stalin dedicates the party to developing heavy industry and to collectivizing agriculture. His principle, everything for the country, nothing for the individual. There is no room for open dissent. Whoever goes against the party line is an enemy of the people.
Imagine, Stalin holds a speech, then divides the country into three great territories. The first has to be totally collectivized by the spring of 1931, the others to follow by the spring of 1932, and then there are a few left behind. We'll give those time until 1933. He was the one who precisely determined what all the farmers were to do at what time. With an appalling, this collectivization was absolutely brutal.
Accompanied by a massive propaganda effort, private farmers are forced into state-run farm collectives known as kolkhozes. The collectivization reverses Leninist policy, which encouraged the farmers to take possession of property belonging to large estate owners with the slogan, "Take back what was stolen." Lenin's way of winning farmers over into the revolutionary fold. Now Stalin is taking land away from them again. Prosperous farmers, the so-called kulaks, are declared to be enemies of the people. Many of them are executed. Others are driven out of the country or deported. Collectivization degenerates into a war of terror against the peasants, lasting several years and leading to catastrophe. In the Ukraine alone, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, over 4 million people starved to death by the early 1930s.
Many Bolshevik leaders, and many of Stalin's comrades, were of the opinion that now that this top-down revolution had been accomplished, now that the farmers were expropriated, the goal of the system had been reached, and socialism had been implemented in Russia. The farmers having lost their property, and the collectives, the kolkhozes, having been set up, that now it was time to develop the planned economy phase. Meaning now the entire population would be involved in the economy. They believed that the goal had been achieved, and so it was no coincidence that the first party congress that took place after collectivization had been accomplished. That was the 17th Congress in January 1934, known as the Victors' Party Congress. In other words, the victors over the Russian farming community.
The 17th Party Congress of 1934 was the Party Congress of the victors, and the communists wanted to celebrate their successes. Collectivization of agricultural economics was accomplished. Industrialization was making good progress. Stalin's statement of accounts was applauded. A political discussion, however, doesn't materialize. Among the 1,200 delegates is also the young Nikita Khrushchev.
My father talked about Stalin all the time. Stalin was a very charismatic person. He just infected all the people who were there. My father talked about Stalin negatively. Mikoyan talked about Stalin all the time. Other people like Molotov talk about him positively, but all of them, until last days, talk about Stalin.
Stalin thinks that all the delegates support him, but his brutal policies have repulsed many. During the secret Central Committee vote, 300 delegates crossed him off the list, while Sergei Kirov, party chief from Leningrad, achieved the best results by receiving only 3 no votes. He was enthusiastically cheered. Stalin could not accept that and saw to it that the ballots against him disappeared. Seemingly unmoved, Stalin poses for photographs with the delegates. But his deadly distrust has been awakened. A short time later, Kirov is shot dead by an assassin.
70% of the Central Committee members who voted for the Victors' Congress were murdered by Stalin in the next 3 to 4 years.
Lubyanka, the seat of the secret police, becomes the center of terror. Thousands disappear forever behind its gates. In show trials, Stalin's former allies like Kamenev and Zinoviev and many opponents within the party are publicly accused, forced to confess and sentenced to death before cheering crowds.
So now the party fell victim to the same terror that had been used against the country's non-Bolshevik elements and groups.
Mexico, 1937. Leon Trotsky, expelled from Russia by Stalin for being a capitalist spy, attacks the show trials in Moscow.
There are no crime in history more terrible in intention or execution than the Moscow trials of Zinoviev Kamenev and Radek Petakov. These trials developed not from communism, not from socialism, but from Stalinism, that is, from the irresponsible despotism of the bureaucracy over the people. A counter-trial is necessary to cleanse the atmosphere of the germs of deceit, calumny, falsification, and frame-ups whose source is Stalin's police, the GPU, which has fallen to the level of the Nazi Gestapo.
But Stalin's arm has a long reach. In August 1940, Leon Trotsky is murdered in his Mexican residence. Millions are shot in the Soviet Union. There are purges in the entire country.
You know, it is the answer how my father survived Stalin, the same as you will go somewhere and meet the person after the earthquake and ask how you survived earthquake. By chance, because he was lucky, nothing else.
In 1937, I helped my father to clean his library, as it was called back then. My father and I brought baskets full of books by Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev and others who'd fallen out of favour, to burn them in the cellar oven.
Im Keller unseres Hauses zu verbrennen. Und jeden Tag
And every day we expected the people to come. Father will be taken away and disappear.
Abgeführt und verschwindet.
A simple denunciation is enough to have someone condemned. The Gulag, a system of huge prison camps, is established. Anyone can fall prey to the arbitrary punishment. The oppression silences any resistance. Stalin's terror will cost millions of lives.
It was truly an evil empire in which the individual was nothing. Not only those who resisted the system and didn't agree with something, but also those who were totally devoted to this system. The whole Leninist Guard was destroyed. Everyone.
The internal opposition in the Soviet Union was almost completely eradicated in the 1930s. Physically destroyed, either shot on the spot or murdered in the Gulag.
In prison, high-ranking military officers were standing next to me. Party workers, local and district secretaries, NKVD staff members. There was no professional group who'd not ended up at this construction site. Nobody paid attention to how many people died, how they were fed or clothed. Nobody was interested. If someone managed to survive for as long as he could, that's how it was. It was a political struggle. We wanted to build a unified society, and upon this foundation, solve the most pressing external and internal problems of our state. But then the question arose, how shall we proceed? Hundreds of thousands of prisoners needed employment, a basis for living, and so we started the big projects.
Stalin discovers that the prisoners' labour is an economic factor. Forced labourers are used for major projects like the construction of the White Sea Canal, building the Siberian Railway, or mining for gold in Magadan.
After 1937, when millions of enemies of the people were taken away, it was decided that they should work. Firstly, we needed gold, and secondly, the people were supposed to drop dead. In winter, there was no beating. If someone could no longer work, then he was not beaten and left alone. But his coat was taken away. He must work, otherwise he will freeze to death. Someone walking ahead stumbled. I didn't know him. We were walking through the tundra, then he fell, out of line, off to the left. Immediately a machine gunner came and shot him on the spot. Then dogs ravaged him. It was terrible. But we were used to that. I never gave up, and that's why I made it.
Despite the all-pervading terror, Stalin's reputation remains unblemished.
But the prisoners believed until the end that Stalin had nothing to do with it, that he'd been deceived, that it was all just imperialist propaganda, with the express goal of deceiving Stalin and the government. Our great scientists, who played a very significant role in our economic development, always spoke of Stalin with great respect, although many of them had been arrested under harsh conditions and still did research. They understood that Stalin did all of that only to solve problems. They always spoke highly of him.
First of all, there was the opinion that it couldn't have been that bad. It was an anomaly. Secondly, maybe there really were criminals and spies at work. And thirdly, once he's liberated himself from that, then maybe things will get better. Many parts of Europe weren't so horrified about Stalin's methods. Firstly, because they didn't believe in the existence of the gulags, and secondly, because they themselves lived and fought under civil war-like conditions, this time for the right cause.
In Russian tyranny, all these reformers were tyrants. You look in the Ivan the Terrible and Ivan the Fourth. He reformed Russia, but he killed half of Russian population. You look in the more contemporary Peter the Great, Peter the First. He is one of the reformer. He built this window to the west, but he reduced Russian population 1/3, and he's still a great reformer. So Stalin, with his 60 million or 50 million of Russians who perished through his so-called reforms, maybe one on this line.
1938. Stalin's internal enemies have been vanquished. Public criticism has been silenced.
Чтобы они были свободны от всякой паники, от всякого подобия паники. Когда дело начинает осложняться, и на горизонте вырисовывается кое-какая опасность, какая бы она ни была. Чтобы они были также свободны от всякого подобия паники, как Ленин.
With unprecedented severity, Stalin has imposed a radical new form of society upon the Soviet Union. Stalin declares that communism, the crowning form of society, has been achieved. But his vision goes even further. Because, according to Marxist teachings, being shapes consciousness, he sets out to create the new socialist man.
Especially young intellectuals are fascinated by radicalism and even a certain brutality. And this radical and brutal side of communism, that we would change everything all at once and find the great solution. That was fascinating, I think. I was still very young, 18 years old, had just graduated from high school a year early because Adolf Hitler needed soldiers. And then I almost became a communist. I had a friend, a sailor, older than me. He'd seen the world, a grown-up, and I was still an adolescent boy. And under this influence, and in opposition to the Nazis, I almost became a communist. I didn't know what communism really was, but I was very attracted to the idea of absolute equality. But that was just a phase.
The idea of absolute equality was fascinating, and Stalin cleverly used this. Parades celebrate the romanticized image of happy people in the workers' and peasant state. The new man should be selfless, work until exhaustion, committed to the communist ideals. And above all is Joseph Stalin.
Communism wanted the new man and undertook a huge experiment over decades to find out if this was possible. It referred to old ideas in doing so, and in the end, the result is that the new man cannot be bred. But this anthropological optimism that one can make a new man, that is, I think, at the core of communism's failure.
Man kann einen neuen Menschen machen, ist, glaube ich, der Kern des Scheiterns der kommunistischen Ideologie.
It was officially declared that Marxism-Leninism is not a political theory, but a science. The science of laws and patterns determining countries and peoples in the past, present and future. Laws, not opinions. This claim to being a scientific ideology with laws and patterns, and the detailed way in which this was presented, starting with dialectic materialism and the psychologically so interesting phenomenon, differing from all non-communist beliefs.
Und der psychologisch so interessanten Erscheinungsform dass im Unterschied zu allen nicht kommunistischen Auffassungen
synthesis, cooperation, collaboration, negative. The history of mankind is determined by conflict, struggle, and contradiction.
Intellectuals from all over the world are invited to the All-Union Congress of Writers in Moscow. They're committed to achieving a more just world. Maxim Gorky holds the keynote speech. In his eyes, the capitalist West is rotten and the future belongs to communism. He puts himself in the service of Stalinist propaganda without any qualms. The international artists give the conference glamour and the regime legitimacy.
Es gab natürlich auch die Illusion.
Of course, there was this illusion. It could never be that bad in the workers' fatherland, because it wanted and was able to offer an alternative to the degenerate, decaying Western society.
Degenerierende Gesellschaft setzen wollte und konnte.
So there was a plethora of varying hopes, ideas, comments, expectations, which led to astonishingly smart people to no, the other way around. Astonishingly intelligent people proved that intelligence and smartness do not have to be identical.
Intelligente Leute bewiesen haben, dass Intelligenz und Klugheit nicht identisch sein müssen.
The Russians were good at creating facades, wonderful facades with nothing behind them. And so they received George Bernard Shaw there, and he came home and said, "Famine? Never heard of it. I've never eaten so much as when I was there."
The German author Leon Feuchtwanger, like many intellectuals, is wary of democracy and lets himself be blinded by Stalin's policy, propaganda in Russian newsreels.
The first impression was that he is unusually unpretentious. Stalin has humour and is receptible to it. One can understand why the masses not just adore, but also love him. He is part of them. The legitimate representative of the 170 million people of the Soviet Union. Even a poet could have not conceived a better one.
If you grew up in the Soviet Union and came to the West, everybody started talking about stability. Stability. Getting all worked up. Crisis. I said, why are you so worried? That's normal. Crisis is normal. Stability is the exception. Very seldom and very insignificant. Thus, an entirely different relationship developed to historical and contemporary phenomena, and a belief that only the Marxists and Leninists have this insight. This goes beyond the current situation, and this played a big role, especially for writers, poets, and what is often forgotten, natural scientists. Those who also started talking about scientific Marxism-Leninism.
Ich würde auch ein bisschen tiefer zurückgehen.
I'd go a bit further back.
Man kann auch das ganze 20.
One could read the entire 20th century as a quest to answer this question.
Eine Suche
what comes after Christianity?
Nach einer Antwort auf der Frage, was machen wir nach dem Christentum?
Where will we find our post-Christian utopias?
Utopien.
And communism was an image of paradise on earth.
Und der Kommunismus war ein Bild des Himmels auf Erde.
The USA, 1929, the stock market crash, the economy collapses. Mass unemployment drives large parts of the population below the poverty line. Many people put their hopes into the ideas of communism.
The Great Depression from 30 to 33 gave many intellectuals the impression that capitalism was collapsing and wouldn't recover.
Bricht zusammen. Und das schaffen die nicht mehr. Und dann,
but in the Soviet Union, they were building. The Depression made it much easier to succumb to the Soviet myth.
The command economy in the Soviet Union is not affected by the crisis. Stalin's five-year plan is successful. Major industrial combines are formed. Thousands of engineers and skilled workers from all over Europe and the US volunteer to help build the Soviet Union. They're not afraid of the communist dictatorship of the proletariat.
I first developed my political awareness in the late 1930s, in a large socialist state, namely New York. And one could say that some of the intellectuals knew very well that Stalin was a tyrant, and that he used socialism to justify the incredible concentration of power, the exploitative use of it, and the tyranny and murder in the gulags.
Ungeheuer Machtkonzentration, Machtausbeutung und Tyrannie und Mord in den Gulags.
On the other hand, many people unconsciously admitted this, but said, yes, but Russia, the Soviet Union, are the only defense against fascism.
Wir machen uns heutzutage etwas vor, indem wir meinen, dass die sogenannte West...
We're deluding ourselves by claiming that the so-called Western world had always been dominant.
Es ist doch so.
It's like this. In the first half of the 20th century, most Europeans believed in other value systems, be it fascism or communism. Only about, let's say, a third believed in the values of liberal democracy. So all of Europe was pursuing other utopias, so to speak.
Also ganz Europa, was wir sagen, auf der Suche nach anderen Utopien.
In Germany, that is Hitler's doctrine of the superiority of the Aryan race. After seizing power, the National Socialists persecute everybody who is different or thinks differently to the point of extermination.
There was apparently only one power strong enough to beat fascism, and that was the Soviet Union under Stalin. And I have many memories. This always recurs. Yes, I don't like a lot of what's going on in the Soviet Union, but it seems to be the only power which can save us from Nazi victory in Europe.
Spain, 1936. A leftist People's Front government has won the elections. Civil war then breaks out. Right-wing forces ally themselves with General Franco's fascists, supported by the German Condor Legion and Italian troops. The Republican government turns to Stalin for help. He sends commissars but no weapons. International brigades with volunteers from all over the world fight for the Republic. But thanks to the use of state-of-the-art weaponry and foreign troops, General Franco's fascists emerge victorious. The socialists and the international brigades are forced to flee.
Stalin, he was not a communist, but an anti-communist. For him, the reaction of the communist world was a secondary issue.
Stalin, throughout the considerable period of communist development in which he ruled, actually regarded foreign communists with suspicion or disdain.
Stalin destroyed 3 times as many communists as Hitler.
The Spanish Civil War at first seemed to confirm that these two totalitarian systems that have sought each other out, communism and National Socialism, would always fight each other to the death.
The defeat in Spain had no significance for Stalin's strategy. He's afraid of being encircled by a coalition between Germany, Italy and Japan. He looks for a way out.
Nachdem alle seine Versuche gescheitert waren,
after all his attempts to forge an alliance with the British and the French against Nazi aggression had failed, Stalin sees no other way to avert war except the non-aggression pact with Germany.
Den Krieg in die Ferne zu lenken, so glaubte er, als ein Nichtangriffspakt mit Deutschland.
According to all the new documents at our disposal, Stalin had the idea essentially, it's impossible to say for certain, to stay out of this world war which he knew was looming as long as possible, and maybe even be the one to benefit when it's over.
Sich auszuhalten und vielleicht hinterher dann der lachende Dritte zu sein.
In August 1939, Foreign Minister Ribbentrop flies to Moscow on Hitler's orders. The two mightiest dictators in Europe sign a non-aggression pact. Hitler wants to free his back for an attack on Western Europe. In a secret agreement, they divide Poland between them. Hitler also lets Stalin have the Baltic states. In the Soviet Union, anti-fascist propaganda is discontinued.
For 3 days and 3 nights, the libraries were closed. You went there, but weren't let into the reading room. Secret, closed. In these 3 days, all anti-fascist books were removed from all Soviet libraries and put into secret storage places. Were no longer lent out.
On September the 1st, Germany attacks Poland. 17 days later, Soviet troops also march into Poland and the Baltic states. The German army occupies almost all of Western Europe, but there is peace in Moscow. Stalin's plan seems to have worked. But only seemingly. On June the 22nd, 1941, Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union begins. In November, German troops are at the gates of Moscow. Stalin declares the Great Patriotic War. The Germans are beaten at an enormous cost. 27 million lives are lost.
And then we won the war, that most terrible war, a war that decided not only the Soviet Union's fate, but also that of the world, especially Europe. We survived the war and made progress, although at a tremendous cost. We lost 90% of the young men born in 1921, 22, 23. 90% of these young men were killed.
90% Männer aus diesen Jahrgängen sind umgekommen.
Yalta, February 1945, the Big Three Conference. Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin discuss what should happen after Germany is defeated.
At Yalta, Europe wasn't centre stage, but the American and British desire to involve the Russians in the war against Japan. For that, they were willing to pay a high price. For Roosevelt, who was the American leader in Yalta, this price meant he was willing to accept that Europeans, continental Europeans, would live literally under Soviet domination for the next 300 years.
Roosevelt, Stalin and Churchill divide Germany into occupation zones. Poland becomes a Soviet satellite, and the border agreed in the Hitler-Stalin Pact is confirmed. Thus, Britain did not achieve its goal of the war, an independent Poland.
After Yalta, the mood became deeply pessimistic. After Yalta, Churchill knew that the war had been lost.
Roosevelt promised Stalin a loan of $4 to $5 billion after the war, etc., etc. But what did we get? In March 1945, April 1945, it had already been set up. Churchill began his Operation Unthinkable, war against the Soviet Union immediately after the end of World War II.
Krieg gegen die Sowjetunion sofort nach Beendigung des Zweiten Weltkrieges.
Soon, allies become embittered enemies. Europe is divided.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Stalin's
post-war program was not to build up socialist states in Eastern Europe. Not Sovietization of these states. And certainly no mention of marching to the Atlantic coast.
Marsch zur Atlantikküste.
Neither Stalin nor the Red Army had the strength to march on, to make a significant advance, especially since American supplies, trucks, gasoline and whatever else that was necessary were not being delivered. But Stalin did have a vision of Russia or the Soviet Union as the only power on the continent.
Our intelligence services received initial information from reliable sources, as they say, about plans for nuclear war against the Soviet Union in the fall of 1945.
At first, democratic parties were allowed in the countries occupied by the Soviet Union, as agreed in the Treaty of Yalta. Stalin declared that each country could choose its own path to socialism.
It was supposed to look democratic, while actually having a tight grip on everything, a classical Kader policy. There were a number of resistance movements, in Poland, the Ukraine, still active for many years in the wilderness. They had enough arms, but by 1949, these movements had all been wiped out.
The Yugoslavian party leader and partisan hero Josip Broz, known as Tito, chooses his own path to socialism. The Yugoslav people cheer when he breaks with the Soviet Union in 1948. The unity of communism has been broken. From now on, Moscow is no longer the spokesperson for all communists. China, 1949. After 3 years of civil war, Mao Zedong declares a people's republic. 32 years after the great Russian October Revolution, the communists are victorious in the world's most populous nation. Mao Zedong, from a family of peasants and a teacher by training, co-founds the Communist Party of China in 1921. He believes that the rural proletariat forms the core of the revolutionary masses. Following Lenin's example, he wins over the peasants by expropriating the owners of big estates. Right after seizing power, the communists commenced transforming Chinese society.
They completely transformed the administrative structure in line with the Soviet model. The entire structure of the party as well, of course, so the Communist Party of China was built as practically a carbon copy of the Soviet model.
Mao had very strong similarity with Stalin, and he knew this.
Mao travels to Moscow for Stalin's 70th birthday. Here, the two most powerful men of the communist bloc meet. Their subjects form almost 1/2 of the world's population. Two dictators who nurture a cult of personality and pursue their goals by force and through terror.
During the Stalin era, there were repression and executions of innocent people. But at the same time, our country experienced an incredible boom. It became a superpower, successfully industrialized the economy and collectivized agriculture. It was a tremendous revolution which helped to advance our country.
Stalin was not an effective leader because through his purges, from his executions, he destroyed so many of the real productive people that it was counterproductive to the country.
Stalinism was really a ruthless self-destruction of talent. And in the process, it almost became a norm in the Soviet system and by extension in the systems that were imitating the Soviet system to promote people who were fundamentally inferior, who were not creative, who were obsequious, who were opportunistic, and who, to put it very simply, were fairly stupid.
On March the 5th, 1953, Stalin dies. Hundreds of thousands of grieving mourners pay their last respects. His successors and rivals for his throne gather around his casket. Stalin's longtime personal secretary, Georgy Malenkov, the party secretary, Nikita Khrushchev, and the powerful Secret Service head, Lavrenti Beria, who already 3 days after Stalin's death orders the release of 1.2 million Gulag prisoners. The power struggle for Stalin's succession has begun. After Stalin's death, everyone is expecting change. Berlin, June 1953. The supply situation in the GDR is critical. There are rumours that the party General Secretary Walter Ulbricht will be replaced.
We followed the advice that Comrade Stalin gave us.
When Ulbricht raises the labour norms, the construction workers at the Stalin Allee site in East Berlin take to the streets. The protests all over the country turn into a national revolt. The protesters storm party offices and demand free elections. Ulbricht asked the Soviet military for help.
Each country have their own mythology. German mythology about these events, that it was a revolution. In reality, and from my father's understanding, it was the strike, economical strike, against some wrongdoings. Secondly, from his opinion, it was the German problem. And when Soviets put their tanks on the crossroads, everything calmed down.
Soviet tanks crushed the rebellion. In Moscow, those rivaling for power exploit this incident for their political aims. They blame Secret Service head Beria for the revolt. In December 1953, Beria is shot dead. In 1955, Malenkov is stripped of his powers. 3 years after Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev has maneuvered himself into a favourable position. At the 20th Party Congress in 1956, he takes another considerable risk. In a spectacular speech, he denounces Stalin's crimes. This is tantamount to blasphemy. But his risk pays off. He manages to convince the delegates.
When Khrushchev held his speech, everybody was naturally shocked because no one knew the extent of repression. And also imagine that the 20th Party Congress was prepared by a man who himself took an active part in the repression. He was personally responsible for thousands of victims. How could one expect objectivity from someone like that?
I will say that 70% it was emotional. It came from his soul and his heart. Because he believed that we are building the best society on the world. It will be communism, where the people live like in the heaven.
The delegates sing the Internationale. They have chosen their new leader, who will lead them into a new and better world. The expectations for Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev are high. Although Khrushchev's speech is not published, its message quickly spreads around the world. The communist parties in the satellite states follow Moscow's example and practice public self-criticism. In Poland, crowds take to the streets to demonstrate for democracy. They force the reinstatement of party chief Gomulka, who had been arrested under Stalin. Khrushchev's trip to Poland can't prevent this.
He provoked Gomulka to make his statement. We will not quit Soviet bloc. We are interested in the presence of the Soviet military in our territory. Khrushchev told, we have a deal, and they became friends.
The Hungarians demonstrate out of solidarity with Poland. They also demand freedom and democracy. The demonstrators first clash with the Hungarian police, then with occupying Soviet forces. The Hungarian army joins the revolt. For a few days, Soviet tanks clear Budapest. The new government under Imre Nagy leaves the Warsaw Pact and declares Hungary's neutrality. For Khrushchev, this is a counter-revolutionary putsch he can't allow.
It was freedom fighters, the ordinary people who fought for their freedom, of course, but behind them were the strong anti-Soviet forces. It was two powers who played this power game, and it was the ordinary people who paid their toll.
With the superior might of Soviet tanks, Khrushchev crushes the revolt. In desperation, Hungary appeals to the United Nations for help, but nothing happens beyond the passing of some resolutions. Khrushchev has reaffirmed his power. Convinced that the communist system is superior, he sets out to win the struggle against capitalism.